Drink responsibly. NakedWines.com, Napa, California.
Our guest today is Nouriel Roubini, who's the CEO of a global macroeconomic consulting firm called Roubini Macro Associates. But he's much better known as the nickname Dr. Doom from the 2008 New York Times piece written on him. So he is a little doomy. He kind of rose to notoriety for predicting the 2008 recession. And the criticism people have said is like, a broken clock is right twice a day. Though I think that's reductive. I mean, he's thoughtful.
He's a very complex thought, thinks he's a great economist and very smart. It's just that, when you have one node, it's like anything else. So I want to hear about what he thinks is good about the economy or anything at all.
Yeah. I read a piece in, I think it was the Times in the pandemic where he was bullish on the economy of New York City. And it was like, Dr. Doom is bullish. I'm like, wow, this is something I want to read.
Right.
But his new book is called MegaThreats, 10 Dangerous Threats That Imperil Our Future and How to Survive Them. What's the summary? What's your takeaway?
Well, first of all, it's MegaThreats. It's everything. It's in red and in big caps. So just remember, it's designed to scare you. And my review is, that's it.
Are any of us going to survive? I feel like that's like a misnomer. He's like, how to survive them.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's very doom and gloom.
We'll see. We'll talk a lot about this because it's a very tough economy right now with the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, everything. There's so much going on. And of course, the 13-year party that's been going on in the stock market and with finance.
Yeah.
So party had to end.
Well, the party is certainly over. And here is Dr. Doom to give it its final death knell.
So your nickname is Dr. Doom. I know you prefer Dr. Realist. So let's be realistic. Everyone knows you as Dr. Doom. Tell me why you don't like that nickname.
I don't like it because I'm not a perma bear. I could give you tons of examples in which I was more optimistic than the markets on major economic and financial risk in the last decade, when the markets were predicting Greek exit from the Eurozone. I said, no, it's not going to happen. When markets predicted twice a hard landing of China, I said, not the case. But of course, the term Dr. Doom is more catchy than the Dr. Realist. So, I'm okay if people tell me that I'm Dr. Doom.
So talk about why you are thought of that way. I'd love to sort of get into it because I want to... Even though your book is called MegaThreats, which we'll talk about in a minute, you do have this idea that the economy is always overheated and that we're headed for the cliff, essentially.
Well, I think that's not a correct characterization. I write pretty much every other day about what's going on in the world, and I have some of the top hedge funds in the world with the global macro that think about my ideas and listen. And if I was a broken clock that is right only twice a day, people would not pay for my consulting services.
Correct, yeah.
I'm very nuanced. I think it is important to think about the kind of things that can go wrong and have a specialty given my work. First, as an academic, doing academic research, theoretical, empirical one. Then 2 years of senior policy making in Washington during the Clinton White House. And then spending, the last 30 years meeting pretty much central bankers, finance ministers, market participants, analysts, and you name it, and trying to make sense of this very complicated world. And I don't think the characterization of me as being always a perma bear, it's correct.
Okay. So do you think politicians and governments listen closely enough to the downside? You were senior advisor to Tim Geithner, Obama's Treasury Secretary. What was your takeaway from that time?
Well, the reality is that politicians sometimes have a very, very short-term view of things. Their economic policy are driven in part by their own popularity and the need to be reelected. And in the US, we have a cycle of 2 years, not even of 4 years. And that constrains the ability to do the right policies. In economics, reaching first best policies is almost impossible. The best you can do, and my experience in government suggests, is that if you can turn down bad ideas, and there are tons of bad ideas that are fourth and fifth best, you're already lucky. And that's the job of an economist as a policymaker. And if you reach second best policies, you're already going to be very lucky. So, but politicians are not experts of economic issues, and they're biased by their own electoral considerations as well.
A lot of Americans blame the current president for inflation. In elections, parties do live and die by economies. Should this really be the frame? Because right now in the U.S., say, midterm elections, it's number one. It's surpassed abortion and other issues. It does take more than 2 to 4 years to screw up an economy, but people do tend to focus on it. So should they do that? Say, oh, yes, it's Biden's fault, for example, in the United States?
Well, things are not black and white. The debate, for example, about the recent surge in inflation, not just in the US, but also almost all other advanced economies and most emerging markets, is the debate between those who say it was due to bad luck as opposed to bad policy. Bad luck was 3 negative supply shocks: the initial COVID shock, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now the continued zero tolerance policy towards COVID of China that is creating further global supply bottlenecks. But it's also true that on the bad policy side, the amount of monetary, fiscal, and credit easing was too much and was too excessive. Mm-hmm. So a number of economists, including myself, pointed out that yes, we're doing too much on the policy side. But compared to other people, we're stressing just the bad policy. I emphasized already starting about a year ago that there were also these negative supply shock, like in the 1970s, that actually complicate further the job of central banks.
Yep.
The negative supply shocks that reduce potential growth, increase cost and inflation, and therefore they make the job of central bank of controlling inflation harder, because either you tighten enough to fight inflation and you cause a hard landing, or if you don't tighten enough, then you de-anchor inflation expectation, you get a wage price spiral like in the 1970s.
So we're going to get your new book in a second. I just want to ask you about your Twitter, because it's really one of the spiciest economist Twitters I've ever seen. It's a low bar, of course. I want to run through your recent tweets. You tweeted, most crypto ideology is straight from lunatic right-wing conspiracies. Please explain. You're particularly bearish on crypto. Explain why.
Well, first of all, I'm not bearish on crypto. From the peak of last November, even the top two, Bitcoin and Ethereum, have lost 70% of their value. The other top 10 have lost like 80% of their value. So this has been an unmitigated disaster. And by the way, these are not currencies. Calling them currencies is a joke. Anybody who knows anything about monetary theory knows that for something to be a currency, it has to be a unit of account. Nothing is priced in Bitcoin. It has to be a scalable means of payment. You can do only 5 transactions per second with Bitcoin. It has to be a stable store of value, but the price can overnight lose 20%. That's why I go to many Bitcoin conferences and blockchain. They don't even accept Bitcoin for payment because their entire profit margin, 10, 15% can be wiped out overnight. They're not stupid.
Yeah, you call it a commodity, in other words. You're sort of calling it.
Listen, using Bitcoin or these things is going back to barter, because the other characteristic of money is to have a single numeraire. So you can price the relative price of goods and services. But if I need a Pepsi token to buy Pepsi-Cola and a Coca token to buy Coca-Cola, I don't even know how to compare the relative price of Pepsi to Cola. Even the Flintstones had a more sophisticated monetary system than crypto. They were using shells as a single numeraire, so I could tell the relative price of bread to meat.
Yeah.
This is going back to pre-barter. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So calling them cryptocurrencies is just a total misnomer. They're not currencies. They're not even an asset.
By the way, is that Flintstone economic?
As I said, the Flintstone had a much more sophisticated monetary system than crypto, and it's not a joke.
Also, a car system. They didn't use gas, just their feet. So that was to save the environment there. So Elon Musk, then, this is your last tweet. Elon Musk is a bully. Scary that he will own Twitter and allow Trump to use again this bully pulpit to divide America, even on the issue of Russia, as Trump and part of the GOP are lackeys of the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. Why do you think Elon is dangerous?
It's dangerous in many ways. First of all, he takes positions like in Dogecoin or Bitcoin, and then he tweets. And he knows that if he tweets about it, the price goes up by 20, 30% overnight. That's, in my view, is market manipulation. If I was at the SEC, I would try to do an investigation on what he's doing. That's something that should not be allowed. And as we know, he's flaunted SEC rules over and over again because they give him a slap on the wrist. Even $1 billion fine for him will be spare change. So that's what he does systematically. And there are dozens of examples of that. But now he wants also to go in the space of geopolitics, but he's trying to cover his own ass. Unfortunately, Elon Musk is stuck with his big factory in Shanghai of Tesla. And eventually, the Chinese are not going to allow him to produce cars and collect data on the Chinese. We'll have a complete decoupling between us and China, especially on the stuff that is technologically, sensitive. I mean, suppose you had electric vehicles or autonomous vehicles from China that are using their software that are all over the United States. And China can monitor everything we do and stop it and shut it down. Would we allow it? Of course not. We're not doing it right now. We're cutting them off completely from anything technology. So you think that the Chinese are going to allow Tesla to run their cars in China with all the data, with all the 5G, with all the information and so on? No way. So what does Elon Musk say then? Says that we should have for Taiwan a special administrative region like we had for Hong Kong, right? Because he wants to appease the Chinese by doing that. It's just nonsense. We know what happened with Hong Kong. The idea you'll have a special autonomy for Taiwan is a joke. So he's trying to save his ass in China. That's what he's doing. But, he's a brilliant man. He's a great entrepreneur, but he doesn't know anything about geopolitics. And now, on top of everything else, he wants to opine about China and Russia. I mean, really, that's a bit excessive. And he's talking his book, by the way.
Yeah.
He's not uninterested. He's self-interested. He's talking his book. That's what he's doing.
Yeah. Now, I have said he doesn't have a real impact. So what's the difference? I mean, I am aware he's talking his book. So what's the difference?
He has a huge bully pulpit. Lots of people listen to him on Twitter and otherwise, and they believe he's like a demigod. I don't think he can directly influence economic and other geopolitical decisions of the United States. But maybe on China, of course, is not going to have any impact. But literally, I mean, trying to defend his own financial interests in China and say that Taiwan should be like Hong Kong is just reckless.
Yeah,
just reckless.
Although still, I don't feel like it matters because he can just do it. It's reckless for him. I don't know if it has any effect on anybody. Well,
he's going to own Twitter. We'll see what he's going to do. We're going to see how he's going to use this platform for other things and so on.
Yeah.
You never know. The guy has a huge, huge ego. Maybe now he thinks I'm not just the best entrepreneur in the country, but I'm also the best political mind, the best geopolitical mind, and he can use in the future that bully pulpit for other purposes.
Yeah, well, he can't run.
I don't know.
He can't run for president because he wasn't born here.
He could try to change the constitution like Schwarzenegger did.
Oh, that works so well. I don't think so. Okay, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about the book, which is, by the way, a bit bearish.
There are more abortion storylines on TV today than, say, 25 years ago. That doesn't mean those storylines get it right.
Often the barrier that we see are the protesters in front of the clinic, but we don't see the, logistical, financial, legal hurdles that really make up the experience of getting an abortion in the U.S. today.
What abortion looks like on screen and why that matters. This week on Into It, Vulture's Culture Podcast.
All right, let's get to the book. It's called MegaThreats. Actually, the way I pronounce it is MegaThreats because it's such a big font and in red. There are 10 of them. They overlap and intersect, as you said. So it's a bit complex. Can you give us a quick summary of the 10 threats?
Well, there are some traditional economic, monetary, and financial threats, but I think the one that I emphasize in the book, in addition to the economic, financial ones, are, first of all, the geopolitical one. We have now a Cold War between 4 or 5 revisionist powers, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and increasingly Pakistan, with the West, US, Europe, and their allies. This Cold War is going to lead to deglobalization, to decoupling of the global economy, to balkanization of global supply chains, to a fragmentation of the global economy. Is going to be dangerous. It's going to reduce growth and increase cost of production, among other things. And the biggest risk is that this Cold War eventually is going to end up into a hot war.
So the first few are your basic things that you talked about, these debt crises. These are things that the world has been through before. Explain what stagflationary debt crisis is.
Well, stagflation means where we have rising inflation and recession at the same time. Mm-hmm. But in the 70s, we had stagflation because of these two oil shocks in 73 and 79, but debt ratios were very low as a share of GDP. So we did not have a debt crisis in Europe and the United States. Mm-hmm. After the global financial crisis, we had a debt problem, too much mortgage debt, housing debt, bank lending to households, but we had a negative demand shock and we had a credit crunch. So we had deflation for a while, so we could aggressively ease monetary and fiscal policy. Today, instead, we have negative supply shocks, and in the chapter 5, I identify 11 additional ones to the recent 3 ones. The recent 3 ones of Russia, China, and COVID may be temporary, maybe not. But there are other things that are medium, long-term, and permanent. So you have these shocks that are going to reduce growth, increase inflation, and with loose monetary and fiscal policy are going to lead to inflation and recession. But, as I pointed out, is that in the 70s, we didn't have a debt crisis. And after the GFC, we didn't have inflation. So we have the worst of the 70s and the worst of the GFC.
All right, you write, in the book, you point out that current Fed Chair Jay Powell and the president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, both have degrees in laws. Both have admitted they underestimated the threat of inflation. Would an economist have been a better choice for the Fed chair?
Well, some of this trouble started with economists like Greenspan or Ben Bernanke. Ben is named as a helicopter Ben because he started aggressive QE and opening the door to very unconventional monetary policies. So even economists have done lots of policy mistakes.
For which he just won the Nobel Prize, but
yeah,
go ahead.
He did. No comment on that.
Okay, no,
but
comment.
My point
comment
is,
on that.
we created...
No, comment on that.
Well, as I said, the beginning of, first of all, he didn't see the housing bust coming. And his view in academic paper was that whenever there is a bubble, you cannot use monetary policy to prick it. So his view was, if a bubble occurs, then you mop up the mess by providing liquidity after. That was the wrong thing to do. You should have either monetary policy or prudential policy preventing a bubble in the first place. And then he misunderstood the nature of this crisis. He thought it was mild and was not mild. And then eventually the policy solution was opening the floodgates to stuff that maybe at that time was necessary, but we did quantitative easing and credit easing at zero rates too much for too long.
Okay, let's be future looking. What kind of economist should it be, like Larry Summers, who's also suggesting tighter policy, or someone like you? Would you ever want the job?
No, thank you. I was in policy for 2 years. It was a great experience, but I wouldn't want to go back to policy. My view is that right now it's too late. The mistakes were done in the last 10 to 20 years. And at this point, if you fight inflation, you're going to cause a severe recession, a financial crisis, and they're going to feed on each other. So you're going to have the mother of all debt crisis and the mother of all economic crisis. And if you instead decide that you want to avoid that, in the short run, you can lift markets. You can prevent a severe recession by printing money like crazy, not raising rates. But then inflation gets out of control. And once you have high inflation, eventually you're not going to avoid the recession. You're going to have inflation and recession. And you're not going to avoid the debt crisis because you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. Interest rates are going to reprice for short-term debt, and then we end up into a disaster. So right now, we have no solution. And we've reached the point in which the mistakes were done in the past. Damn if you do, damn if you don't. What I make as an argument that the policymakers right now are talking tough on inflation, but faced with an economic crash and a financial crash, they're going to wimp out, they're going to blink, and they're going to monetize these debts. Because the alternative, severe recession and financial meltdown in the short run, is politically unacceptable. They wimped out in the past. The Fed wimped out in 2019 when there was a mild pressure and the reverse quantitative tightening, the reverse raising rates. They're going to do it over and over again. They have no choice.
So you criticize American policymakers for creating bubbles with cheap money and debt and then do nothing to deal with them, as you noted. The Chinese, on the other hand, are actively trying to deflate their own overinflated real estate bubble, for example. Do you think that will work? And should Americans have done the same or do the same? Or is it, as you say, too late?
Even the Chinese, their model of growth was credit-fueled fixed investment. And the kind of investment they did in real estate, commercial, residential, state-owned enterprises were just usually excessive. China doesn't have enough consumption. There's a lot of fixed investment. It was all financed with credit and debt. And now the debt to GDP ratio of China is 330%, only slightly lower than advanced economies. So right now they're trying to control it. But every time the economy slows down because they are worried about leverage, then they reverse themselves. It's a yo-yo. They worry about leverage, then the economy slows down, then they panic about growth, then they ease again, then leverage creates again and again and again. It's like the US, it's like Europe. is like other advanced economies. Their policies are no different.
All right. Speaking of China, let's move to the global macroeconomic threats. This was the most interesting section for me and my producers. In one chapter, you say we are in a new Cold War between the U.S. and China, which you discussed just earlier, which is leading to deglobalization. Another, you write that whoever controls AI may become the dominant world power. What's the bigger risk for the U.S.? Economic pain caused by decoupling from China or maintaining close economic ties with China and allowing them to win the AI race, which many think they already have?
Well, the issue is whether you can compete with China and prevent them from dominating the industries of the future. And all the industries of the future are going to be related directly and indirectly to AI,
yes.
machine learning, IoT that allows you to collect the big data, and then 5G or 6G that's going to allow you to then use this data to create goods and services and so on. Can you, at the same time, engage China, cooperate on some things, compete on other things, and confront China on other ones? That will be the ideal world. But my view is that we're moving towards a situation in which cooperation is nowhere to be seen on anything. They don't want to cooperate on climate change. They didn't cooperate on pandemics. They don't want to cooperate on financial things. They want to create their own alternative international monetary, trading, financial currency system. That's what they're doing. They've given up on the West. So there is no cooperation. We're competing on everything, but we are not now also confronting each other. From a Chinese point of view, we're trying to contain them. And from the US point of view, China has used lots of tools to have unfair trade and stealing our intellectual property rights, and now it's becoming a geopolitical threat, not just an economic threat. So this is the Thucydides trap.
Right.
And the question is only whether this Cold War that is becoming colder is going to lead to a hot war or not. And when that's going to happen,
now,
that's the question.
I've been writing about the threat from China for years and years, way back when, because it's very apparent that they were moving ahead, not just as a copycat or a stealer of IP, but an actual creator of innovation and everything else. So the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, essentially gone to war with China's tech industry, something I watch very closely. They recently announced new export limits on semiconductors and related technology. That's led companies to pull their engineers from projects. Everyone's including Apple, which is, I think, one of the most ensconced companies. They're moving to India and other places. Is it wise for Biden to go after China so forcefully?
If anything, actually, the Biden administration is tougher on China than Trump. So in that sense, the U.S. Has a consensus that China is a strategic competitor, and we have to address this strategic competition. And how we do it is through lots of stuff, starting with technological restriction. But one point I think is important. Once you restrict, say, 5G, because, say, if our phones were using Huawei 5G, there will be a backdoor to the Chinese government. Tomorrow is not just our phones. Of course, our autonomous vehicle system are based on big data, IoT, 5G, and therefore who controls that stuff can control also whether your cars are moving or not. But every piece of consumer products, even low-end ones, even your toaster, even your microwave, even your coffee machine is going to have a 5G chip. So if your phone is a listening device, your toaster is a listening device. So decoupling on this thing implies that 10 years from now, we should not buying even toasters or coffee machines. So a world in which you decouple technological is a world in which every good and service in the future has some of that 5G. And therefore, you have to decouple 100% on everything with China. I don't think people have realized what 5G decoupling implies for decoupling on the entire dimension of the trade relation between U.S. and China.
This is everything. It absolutely is.
It's everything, literally everything.
It's so funny that all the focus is on TikTok when it's actually the toaster. No, I mean, beyond
literally, the toaster is as much of a listening device.
TikTok.
I mean, they started to worry about the webcams, right?
Yes.
In the homes and in the government. But that's, again, every piece of anything. Your coffee mug is going to have a 5G chip in the future.
Can the U.S. actually win here, or is it too late? Do you see a possibility? There's thoughts about returning manufacturing to the United States. We, of course, invented the internet. Is there a way to get back, and how does that happen?
Well, from a point of view of innovation, I would say that the U.S. is still ahead of China. And the Chinese policy bashing the private sector are going to lead to a weakening of private sector confidence. And command and control doesn't work very well when it comes to true innovation and so on. So you can throw a lot of money, and they're doing strides on it. But I would say that we have the right technologies, the right innovation, and so on. What we don't have is manufacturing, but we have to start to think also about a new industrial policy. I mean, the Chinese know that probably they're not going to have access to our semiconductors and maybe possibly those of Taiwan unless they take over Taiwan. But the risk is that China is going to take over Taiwan or bombs even those factories. And then we are really naked. That's why the US has said to Samsung, has said to TSMC, why don't you start building semiconductor factories in the United States? We haven't done it for a while. So we have to think about an intelligent industrial policy, not just industrial and manufacturing, also technology in general. Yes, we can still be successful. We can win that war, but we cannot just be laissez-faire about it and think that the market is going to take care of it. If you go to the market folks like Tesla and Elon Musk are caring about their own profits. They're not caring about national security. They're even willing to appease China and Taiwan. So we cannot rely on the Teslas and the Elon Musk of the world for having enlightened economic policy for this threat.
All right. So lastly, I want to talk about global warming and environmental collapse. This is another area I've been writing about for years now. This is sort of the big deal. None of this really matters if this is happening. You write that to keep increases below 2 degrees Celsius means a carbon tax rate closer to $200 per ton of CO2 emitted. What would that do to the economy? And it's not just carbon release, it's all kinds of, I mean, there's so many different things happening. How do you look at that as probably the worst problem we face, I think?
Eventually, it's the worst problem. We can still destroy each other through financial meltdown or through a war between great powers the next decade, while the environment is a slow-motion train wreck, but the economic damage is becoming severe. Mm-hmm. Look just this summer where you had massive droughts in India and Pakistan, throughout Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, mm-hmm. most of the U.S., actually, from Colorado, California, mm-hmm. we have a long-term drought, and 1/3 of all vegetables and 2/3 of all fruits and nuts in the U.S. are produced in California. The farms are selling their water rights to mm-hmm. other people because that's more profitable than growing food. That's why food prices were already spiking before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Same thing with energy prices. I'm all in favor of decarbonizing, and we have rightly bashed fossil fuels and big oil, but they've collapsed their own capacity of new production of fossil fuels, but the rise of renewable has not been sufficient to compensate for that. That's why Brent oil prices were already $100 per barrel before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we have to think about these things and conceptually. And what's happened is that there's a lot of talk about net zero emissions and dealing with the environment.
That's
and lots
Bill
of
Gates.
talk about ESG. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but a lot of it, honestly, and I follow it closely both in the corporate sector and the financial sector, is greenwashing, green wishing, green fig leaves. It's really talk, and there is almost no action. So my worry is that all the solutions, and there are plenty of solutions with current technologies, are mission impossible. Mm-hmm. Mitigation means net zero implies negative economic growth with current technologies.
Yes, it
we
does.
had a recession, the worst in 60 years. In 2020, net emission fell only by 9%. Mm-hmm. Adaptation is too costly, and geoengineering is freak science, right? Throwing dust particle in the atmosphere to reflect the sunlight. So unfortunately, those solutions are not. And carbon tax, as I said, to achieve 2, you need a carbon tax of $200 a ton. Today, the average is 2.
So let me just end on where we started on these predictions. They're quite dire. I'm sorry to tell you, you are bearish. But
maybe they're realistic if you think about it.
Okay, but you've also made, I mean, in the interim, in March, for example, 2009, you said the S&P would fall below 600. It gained 65%. You thought there'd be...
I made mistakes like everybody. I'm not perfect, and I don't believe that anybody can predict things, you know, and I never claim otherwise.
So these predictions are quite dire. Why should people be confident? And what do you hope that you got wrong, or you're going to get wrong here? And what do you say to people in terms of being confident in your predictions? Because right now it's grab your head and go under the desk.
Listen, we think that the world is going to be like the last 75 years. What I'm arguing is that before those 75 years, between 1918 and 1945, we had World War I, the Great Depression, trade war, inflation, deflation, hyperinflation, fascists and Nazis coming to power in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in Japan, and other countries. We had World War II, we had the Holocaust, and I'm Jewish, and then we had all the other disasters. And my job is to say, we live in a very different world. We had 75 years of relative peace and prosperity, in spite of all the economic cycle, in spite of all the mess. And we got used to actually half of humanity going from very poor to achieving less poor and then middle class. What if we go back not only to the 70s, and that's going to happen, we're going to have stagflation. What if we go back to the 1930s and 40s? The kind of mega threats that I worry about signal that that's a possibility. Is it inevitable? Absolutely not. Are there policies that are going to lead to prevent it? Yes. But my view is those policies are hard to achieve. The question is, are we going to do it? And from a realistic point of view, my fear is that we don't have the consensus internally and externally to do the right thing. That's why we're headed towards a disaster.
All right. Do one bit of hope at all, Nouriel, or not?
It's technology. In the chapter that is utopian, I say that if, for example, it's not going to be solar panel, the revolution in energy might be fusion. If you're going to have fusion really successful fast enough before we get to 3 degrees, then the energy costs very little, the greenhouse emissions are zero, economic growth boosts, you can produce so much more food because water becomes cheap and you can desalinize it. You have huge economic growth. Of course, there'll be inequality because technological innovation benefits capital and the high-skilled workers. Everybody else is going to lose their job with AI automation, but then at least we can have a universal basic income and we can redistribute to have a future that is more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, without conflicts among countries and so on. But technology has to be the solution.
Technology, I can't believe it. Technology is the answer. All right, last question. Your advice to Biden right now about China or inflation, pick one and keep it short, Nouriel.
On China, I think we have the right policy. That is a strategic competition. But I think the key issue is going to be when China makes a move on Taiwan, what we're going to do? Just give the weapons to Taiwan? Or we're going to really defend Taiwan. If we're going to really defend Taiwan, we have war with China. And that war from conventional becomes unconventional. So do we want to go to World War III and nuclear annihilation to essentially defend Taiwan? I don't know that even Biden has the answer to that question. I think that's a key question. And there's not a clear answer to it.
All right, I have one more quick question. If you're the average person, where do you put your money, Nouriel?
My suggestion will be right now, you lose money on equities, you lose money on long-term bonds, and you lose money on cash because of inflation. If you want to protect yourself, your portfolio, the investment should be short-term treasuries that reprice, tips that are inflation index that reprice, gold, precious metals, and some commodities are going to go up in value when there is inflation. And if there is moderate inflation, some forms of real estate are going to be the right investment because they protect you against inflation. But a good third of all real estate stock in the U.S. is going to be stranded because of climate change, flooding, hurricanes, sea rise levels, wildfires, droughts, and you name it. Half of the U.S. is going to have to move somewhere else, Midwest into Canada the next 20, 30 years. And therefore, even your real estate investment should be done in light of the coming environmental disaster.
Oh my God, I have to move to Kansas? All right, I'll do it. Okay.
Or Canada, Montreal, or Toronto, or Ottawa.
That's the plan.
There's plenty of land.
Okay, I'll remember that.
In Canada.
Okay.
And it's a great country.
Okay, great.
So we'll have to merge U.S. with Canada. I think that's likely to happen.
All right.
Eventually.
Oh, no. Oh,
the United States of North America.
Nouriel, I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I guess goodbye. Oh, my goodness gracious.
Yeah.